Welcome to the Blue Heart Podcast. I'm your host and conversational guide, Lieutenant Joe Pangaro. This podcast is for you, the men and women of law enforcement, because ours is a noble profession, worthy of your heart, your passion, and your life. Now, let's get to the heart of the matter. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Blue Heart Podcast. I'm Lieutenant Joe, your host, and I want to, first of all, thank our sponsors, right? We wouldn't be here together, the men and women of the Blue Line, we wouldn't be here together if it wasn't for them. So the first one is my publisher, right? That's blue360media.com. They are the ultimate publishers of everything law enforcement. If you need anything you want to learn about in law or law enforcement, you go to blue360media.com. They have it. My books are there. The interview, the investigation, you'll find them there. And also for you New Jersey people, we have Medical Essential Diagnostics. Now they cover any worker in the state of New Jersey, municipal, state, county, doesn't matter. If you're a public employee, you can go to medicalessentialdiagnostics.com. There are 5 offices in the state of New Jersey. You call them up, you make an appointment, you go in and you get a full health screening at no cost to you. You put down your insurance card, whatever you got, your wife's insurance, your cousin's insurance, whatever, and they give you a full, complete screening. And you can also bring 2 other adults in your family with you. So find out that you have something wrong before it kills you, right? Go and be able to get your pension, enjoy your life. So Blue 360 Media and Medical Essential, thank you. All right, so today I have an interesting law enforcement guy here for us. This is Steve Neal. Steve comes to us. He was a law enforcement officer for 30 years in Chesterfield, Virginia. I think I got that right, which is right outside of Richmond, a pretty big city. He'll tell you a little bit of his background, but he retired as a captain, and now he is a writer. So a lot of us, I guess, want to tell our stories is what this comes down to. As we go through this career, we have interesting things to see and to say. And just talking with Steve for a couple of minutes, just so you know, we're going to give you some contacts to his books because I think you'll find them very interesting. Steve, welcome aboard the Blue Heart Podcast.
Hey, Joe, how you doing? It's good to see you, and thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So why don't you tell everybody a little bit about you, your career, what you did in your career, and we'll go from there.
Well, I was in law enforcement for about 30 years. As you said, Chesterfield, Virginia. We were a large suburban agency right outside of Richmond, Virginia, about 600 employees that we had. Interesting story, though. I got into law enforcement for a little bit different reason than most people. I had no connection as a youth, no background, no relatives, had no connection to law enforcement at all. But when I turned 18, I got in a little trouble with the law. And I actually was arrested there in my hometown. And I went through that whole process, and I didn't like it. I didn't like the way it happened. The police roughed us up a little bit. They treated us poorly. The court system was poor. I didn't like the whole system. So after a couple of years and I got it out of my system, I made a conscious decision that, you know what, that wasn't done well, and I need to get in this business and see if I can make a difference. And I spent my whole career doing that.
That's really very interesting because most people start the other way. I mean, I never had an interest in law enforcement. You know, when I was young, I wasn't a bad guy, but if I saw the police, I went the other way. I had a cousin who was a police officer, was retired as a sergeant, and they called him Midnight Charlie because he loved midnights. Once I got on the job, I didn't care for midnights that much, but he loved them and he worked them all those times. And he was kind of a person who led me on. And then I found I had a love for the work. Once I got there, what an amazing career. I loved every minute of it. So I kind of get what you're talking about. Now, as we're going forward here, I see that there's a poster on the wall behind you, Bearing Witness. That's one of your books. And I can barely see the other one, but I know the name is Toxic Boss Blues.
Yes, sir. Toxic Boss Blues. I actually wrote as soon as I retired. It's something that I did and worked on and lived with my whole career. But like most police officers, I worked 3 and 4 jobs just to try to make ends meet. I didn't have time to write a book when I was still working. So when I retired, I said, you know, I've been talking about this my whole life. I'm going to actually put it down on paper. So I wrote the book. Toxic Boss Blues is a leadership book, but it deals with the toxic boss problem that we seem to have in the law enforcement business. And I've been all over the country. I've talked to police officers all over the country, and it's the same everywhere you go. Every police agency seems to have that problem with toxic bosses. And I had my own personal experiences with it. We can tell the story here in a little bit if you choose, but I had no resources at the time. There was nowhere to turn. Nobody knew anything about it. In that day and era, you just kept your mouth shut and you didn't have a right to challenge authority. So I had no resources when I faced my own personal issue. And after I retired, I said, you know what? I know there's others who are having this problem. So I'm going to put this down and maybe it can help somebody.
I think that's awesome because, one of I teach also. One of the things I do, I have a police training company, and I teach a leadership course. And what I've broken it down to, when you look, is I call it the 85%. You got 85% of everybody in every organization, leadership all the way through people who do the work. They'll do just enough to get by. That's it. They'll do stuff to get by. Then you got 10% of people who actually want to do better. They're just not really sure how. There's not a lot of mentoring. There's not a lot of coaching. It's my way or the highway in lots of places. And then you have the 5% who really drag everybody forward. In every organization, there's those people. But leadership in law enforcement is so important because, as they say, the fish rots from the head down. Well, if you don't have a good leader, then you're going to have a difficult agency. And I don't pick on bosses here, but the reality is, if you are a leader, if you're out there in a position of authority, no matter where you are, all the way up to the chief, I believe in servant leadership. That's what I teach. Servant leadership. The higher you go in any organization, the more you owe those people below you. And we do see that's a problem. So toxic bosses, we'll get into that, I think, a little bit more in detail as we go forward, because I think it's important for people who are going to be bosses, and then maybe for somebody who's already there that it wants to be better, a 5%er, a 10%er wants to be better. So that's excellent.
And that's the feedback that I've gotten on the book. Fortunately, that book's done very well, sold all over the world. And the feedback that I've gotten is this book is good for the officer who is facing a toxic boss situation. The book is good for somebody who wants to do better, and it's actually good for somebody who is a toxic boss who decides that maybe they need to change their ways a little bit.
Well, I'm telling you, that would be amazing, because I worked for several different chiefs, from great, absolutely amazing people to people who were really bad, a really bad chief who really damaged the entire agency. I had my personal run-ins with them. It's why I retired as a lieutenant and not a captain or chief. I had to make a choice between my people and my career, and I ran into this boss, and I did what I could to protect them. So that's a huge topic, dealing with that difficult boss. We see some people tell you, fight them, go to the PBA, sue everybody. But I got to assume that there's better ways to do it than just, bare knuckle fighting with the authority, because you can't always win.
No, it's absolutely right. And as you said, I retired as a captain instead of chief because of my fight with a toxic boss. My last 12 years in our organization, I was a captain. Prior to that, my career had gone extremely well, and I was on the way up. But after I had this confrontation with the chief, the toxic boss, I stayed right where I was for my last 12 years. So your point on that is absolutely on target, 100%. In the book now, I've got a specific list and very detailed ways in which an officer can address this problem. And there are sometimes you have to confront, but there are a lot of other tactics that you can use to make it better for yourself as well.
Well, I'll tell you, I would tell everybody, get the book. If you're dealing with a toxic boss, get the book, because what you want to learn from, especially in law enforcement, we want to learn from people who have already been down the road, people who've walked in your shoes, done what you've done, whether it's to be an investigator, to be a great patrol officer, an excellent correction officer. Talk to people who have done it and find out, learn from their mistakes and from their positives. So I would suggest that you get the book. Steve, can you give us just one thing? If there's some cop out there is really trying to do the right thing, that's not one of these squeaky wheels that complains about everything, but somebody who's really trying to do the right thing, and for whatever reason they got this toxic boss, just doesn't like them or is giving them a hard time, just one thing that they could maybe consider.
Absolutely. Well, I've got about 12 different things in the book, but I'd say probably the number one issue that's most important for an officer is what I call document, document, document. And if you're in some kind of a battle or something that's not like it ought to be, then he who wins is going to be he who has the best evidence. It's the same way in a criminal case. It's the same way in a civil case. It's the same way when you're fighting a toxic boss. So if you're in a battle with a toxic boss, you have to document everything. And in today's world, that's not that difficult to do with phones. Of course, you have to know your state's laws about wiretapping and things like that. You have to understand what you're legally allowed to do. But you document all the meetings, who was there, who said what, who did what. You document physical, like say a memo that was sent out. You keep a record of that. You can even FOIA emails and things that are going to be evidence that's going to help you get the advantage if you're having to face this situation. So documentation, I think, is probably the number one piece if you're fighting a battle.
Okay, I think that's good, and I think the other 11 would be helpful. I know for me, I tried to take I was always respectful to my chief. I respected the rank, even though he was not respectful to me or many of the other officers. Unique personality that his negativity was. But I tried to go in and say, okay, listen, chief, can we have a frank conversation? I'm not here to hurt you. I'm not here to fight you. I'm not here to be a problem. I'm here to protect the men and women that are in my command. And protect might not be the right word, but I wanted to make sure that things were done properly. If somebody did something wrong, you take a bite, but it's got to be fair. And there's problems that people have, they do something. Our business is very liquid, so they can make a mistake, but is it a mistake of the head where they purposely did something wrong? Or is it of the heart? They tried to do the right thing and it went sideways. You deal with those differently. And the leader we had didn't. Everything was just my way or the highway. And I tried to talk to him, and I thought initially that it might work, but unfortunately it didn't over time. And then I just had to make my stand, and I was professional. I did my job, but I made sure that the people below me who were looking to me for leadership, I did the best I could in my career. So I think that's great.
Well, and that's what
get to that.
exactly. That's what we as leaders do. We're looking out for them. We work for them, as you said, servant leadership, and it's our job to make sure that they have the best opportunity to be successful. That's what we do. That's our job.
Absolutely.
And it's interesting, your comments you just made are taking us down the road of the other 11 things that are in the book about successful ways to deal with a toxic boss. So you're right on point.
Yeah, I guess it's a common thread when you've lived this and you've done it the right way. You kind of know these things, even though I didn't write them down like you did. I probably have a lot of those 11 that I dealt with. Now,
there's no doubt about it. There's no doubt. And when you read the book, you're going to be doing this. Yep, yep, yep. Because that's what it's about. That's how I wrote it on purpose, so that it would be good, solid, universal advice for anybody that needed it.
That's excellent. And I got to say, if you are a boss out there and you're not sure, am I toxic? How do they read the book? Find out if you're in there. Because one of the things that when I teach the class, the leadership, I'll say, okay, now what are some good traits of leaders? And people call them out. I said, are you those things? Can you be those things? Why can't you? Or are you already part of that? And then I ask them, what's some negative traits? And they rattle them all off. I said, do you have those? Can you change them? Can you fix them? It's self-introspection. If you want to be a great leader, you got to constantly be looking at yourself. What am I doing? Why am I doing it? And how am I doing it is really what's going to make you a leader. So
well, let me just step that up. Let me just step that up one step, because I agree with you 100%. The last chapter in Toxic Boss Blues is how to be an effective principled leader. And I believe that principled leaders are where we need to be. And I list out a lot of things, the so-called traits and characteristics, but the traits and characteristics are not what make us principled leaders. What make us principled leaders is what we actually do, our behavior, the things we say and do. Somebody can say, oh, well, he's smart. Well, that's fine to be smart, but it's what you do that's going to make you successful as a leader. So I list out what I call a roadmap in Toxic Boss Blues in the last chapter, and it's a roadmap for how to be an effective principled leader.
I think that's great because, like I said, we don't want to attack leaders. Leaders have a lot of stresses that maybe we don't understand, but being a good leader is important to your entire organization, in your community as well. All right. So you want
means everything.
All right. So now the next one, bearing witness to evil. I mean, when I heard that title, I loved it because, we all have experiences with evil that the average citizen doesn't realize what's out there. But you do. So what is bearing witness to evil about?
Well, Bearing Witness to Evil is actually a true crime book. And what I did, went back and picked out 15 cases that from my career that I had a connection with that I thought were very significant. And then in the book, we retell the story about what happened on the case, but give a little bit of insider information, a few tips because I was there. So I would know some things that, you wouldn't have been put in the public or wouldn't have been published in the paper. So we retell the case, but the real thing that's I really like about that, each case has what we call a story behind the story. And the story behind the story is something that nobody knew about. There's always things behind every case that nobody knows about. They don't make the
Mhm.
public or whatever. I'll give you an example. One of the stories in the book was about Timothy Spencer, who was a serial killer in our area back in the late 80s, 1988, 1989. Well, Timothy Spencer got convicted, and the primary evidence that it was a regional case, not just my jurisdiction, but the primary evidence that we had against him was DNA. And at that day and time in the late 1980s, DNA was brand new. And in the Timothy Spencer case, he ended up being convicted for all these homicides. And in fact, he was the first person in the world to ever be executed based upon DNA. So it makes his story a little bit unique and a little bit different.
I think that's excellent and amazing. Even in my book, The Investigation, I chronicle as a story and a learning opportunity a really brutal double homicide that took place at the Jersey Shore, and I was the lead detective on it. And the insights that you get, not everybody understands. One of the things, I write columns, a lot of columns, and one of the things I was struck by, and this was a very bloody scene because this guy cut the heads, hands, and feet off an elderly woman and his girlfriend. It was really brutal scene. There was a moment in there when the forensics people left and the patrol officers were outside, and I was in the house with the deceased, and it was silent and it was quiet, but there were smells, the smells of raw blood, the echoes you could hear through the house that were now silenced. It was really a unique experience, and I wrote about it. And when I published the article, people wrote to me and said, "Oh my gosh, I felt like I was right there. I never would have imagined that something's like that." We do have a unique perspective on society. I call it a backstage pass to life. As law enforcement officers, we go places and do things that the average person never gets to see, and I think those kind of perspectives in your stories are probably excellent. As
Yeah,
a matter of fact,
we've seen things as law enforcement officers that you really shouldn't see. There are things that are so bad and so psychologically impactful that they're not good for us. I tell you, if we've got time, I'd like to add one more little story from that book
sure.
that I think you'll find interesting. And it's actually why I got the idea to create the book. We had a case many years ago that was considered to be the most vicious homicide in the area in ever. A girl was stabbed 181 times, and in fact, the medical examiner said there were more, but he just stopped counting after 181. That's all he could do. Very heinous, vicious case. The guy that got arrested for that case was ultimately put to death in the death penalty case. The interesting piece, though, is the suspect's brother is a very significant law enforcement figure in our area. He had an almost 40-year career. He ended up as a deputy chief, as honest, clean, hardworking person you'll ever know, just straight as an arrow. He was a friend of mine all through the years. So I had this idea that maybe we could put these two different aspects of a book together, the story about the crime and then the story behind the story. So I went to my friend and I asked him if it would be okay to feature his story in the book as the story behind the story, and he agreed. And that's how Bearing Witness to Evil was born. He is the contrast between my friend, a 40-year professional law enforcement executive, even, and his brother, who was the most heinous killer in the history of the state, just makes for an incredible read. And again, that's the reason why we got the book together like we did.
Well, I think that's really, I hate to use the word amazing, but that is amazing because you have two sides of the same coin, totally different. I mean, totally opposite sides, good side and an evil side, right in the same house, growing up together. They probably ate meals together like families do. They played together. One becomes
Right,
law enforcement, one's a serial killer, probably one of the worst things you can possibly have out there. Well, one of the
right.
things I want
And,
to say, go ahead, go ahead.
I'm sorry. The brother, the law enforcement officer, was put in a position when his brother was facing the death penalty. The defense attorney asked him to testify on his brother's behalf, and he said, "I'm sorry, I can't." He believes in the principles of law enforcement and good over evil and right versus wrong, and he was unable to testify against his own brother. So that tells you a little bit about his character and convictions.
Well, I think that says a lot about a lot of us that walk the blue line. You know, we do start out, most of us in that interview when you get hired. Why do you want to be a cop? I want to help people, right? And you don't realize
Right.
over the course of your career, most people that you do help, you never hear from. It's everything else that goes on. But I think those are excellent stories, Steve. And what I want to let everybody know is that I'm going to bring Steve back on, and we're going to do individual episodes, which each one of the things in the Bearing Witness to Evil book, and we'll talk about those. Steve's also going to be starting his own podcast that we're going to try and get that on the network here, because obviously an interesting guy, great career, a lot to say, and we'll try and get that up on the network here and really spread the word around there. So, Steve, I appreciate you being here. We have to do this again. One of the things I want to let everybody know is you can get Toxic Boss Blues, and you can also get Bearing Witness to Evil on Amazon. Go look them up. They also have their own websites, www.toxicbossblues and www.bearingwitnesstoevil.com. I will put in the comments those addresses, but you can go look it up, Steve Neal on Amazon, and go get those books, because we always keep learning. You're going to learn from reading those stories of what Steve did and how he investigated it, what was involved in the backstory, because you are going to come across those things in your career. And the more we know, the better. One of the things I say all the time in any kind of a training that we do, you do not want the first time you have to do something to be the first time you thought about it. So that's why we constantly learn, go to training, read, see what other people did, become the best law enforcement officer you can, because your community depends on it. You got to think about that. I thought about, what happens if somebody in my family needs to call the police? My adult children, they don't live around here anymore. If they need to call the police, I hope an officer shows up that knows what they're doing, that has experience, that does the right thing as a professional law enforcement officer. Reading and learning is what gets us there. So, Steve, thank you very much for being here. Let's get together very soon and set up some dates and get you back on and start going through these things.
Thank you. And let's look forward to doing that.
All right, everybody. Remember, take a look at Blue 360 Media, Medical Essentials, Save Your Lives, and go get Steve's books. You'll learn something. You'll be a better law enforcement officer. Have a great day. We'll be back soon. Lieutenant Joe and the Blue Heart Podcast Network would like to thank our sponsors. Blue 360 Media. You can find them at www.blue360media.com. And Medical Essential Diagnostics. You can find them at www.med-nj.com. We would also like to thank the Blue Heart Network production team, led by Senior Executive Director Todd Pangaro. Be careful out there. Do what's right.